evening, everybody. Welcome to another Ask Professor Paranormal. That's me, Lloyd Auerbach, parapsychologist, and I'm glad to see that we have some folks already here and even a couple questions coming. I actually have a couple questions from last time that I didn't get to, but first I thought I'd address the question that Allie put in that Edgar C. has kind of seconded. And this kind of connects to the two questions that I had left over. First of all, we are 99.99999% sure in parapsychological work and in the history of the field over 140 plus years that apparitions, ghosts, are not optical phenomena. You can't take a picture of it because they don't give off light or reflect light. The reason why people say that they get or think that they have photos of paranormal phenomena the eye cannot see, such as the orb stuff, is because there are other explanations for the things that have been identified or classed as paranormal photos by ghost hunters and TV shows out there. We have to look at each individual picture to determine what might be going on. But if it's the orb kind of thing, which are very flat, circular things, those are reflections. There are other potential issues for them. You know, even when the orb phenomena was coming into its height back in the late 1990s, Fujifilm posted a page on their website explaining how orbs are created that had nothing to do with apparitions, paranormal stuff whatsoever. So much stuff that comes through on the TV shows especially, but on ghost hunter sites identifying photos as paranormal have no paranormality, if you want to use that term, to them whatsoever. And for us looking at photographs, one of the key elements is not whether you saw, although that certainly can help, of course, an apparition when you take a picture, but did anybody have an experience at that time? It doesn't matter if the place has a reputation for being haunted, but did anybody have an experience at the time? Was there any other indication that something anomalous was happening? All those things are important. So cameras, even those supposed full spectrum cameras, which really aren't full spectrum, are not capable of picking up something that does not either reflect light or give off light of some kind. That's not what cameras can do. Now you can manipulate, of course, the algorithms that are assessing the data that comes into digital cameras. And I'm not even talking about Photoshop, but someone could actually program a device that works like a camera or is a camera to make sure that certain things pop up. Plus, there are a ton of ghost camera apps that will either automatically or with a choice put ghosts on the picture. So that's kind of like the basic statement. So I'd have to see a picture, Allie, that you think is paranormal to even determine what was going on. But we need corroborating evidence. Somebody's experience, because the only, if you want to call it a device, that can pick up ghosts happens to be human beings. Maybe animals. We just can't get straight answers out of the animals, the pets, and so on. And this kind of speaks to another question. Number one, which is a question I kind of posted on Twitter before the last one. I just never got to it. And that's the question of, where do ghosts get their clothes from? You know, in our society, our culture, and this is different in some other cultures, of course, ghosts who are seen, are wearing clothing. They often are perceived, and most often perceived, looking like they did when they were younger. In other words, if somebody dies at age 92, they might appear to relatives or other people, or even down the line, as someone who looks in their 30s, looks a lot healthier. So they have clothing on. And folks who have been around this Ask Professor Paranormal a while, or taking my classes, certainly know what I'm talking about here. And that is, what someone sees is not actually optical. Again, I mentioned that a couple minutes ago. It's not the eye that's seeing that. You, if you are a witness to seeing a ghost, are picking that up using your extrasensory perception. That's perception without the senses, non-sensory perception. You're picking up, think of it as a signal the ghost is giving off. And what the ghost is doing is thinking of themselves, the way that they look, the way that they smell, the way that they sound, all of that. In other words, the same thing that those of us who are alive do, a self-image. We all have a self-image of ourselves. And I know from many, many surveys, as well as kind of some polls that I've done at so many different lectures over the years, including college lectures and other large audience groups, that when we think of ourselves, when we picture ourselves in our head, we don't picture ourselves naked. There are a few people that might do that, but it's pretty rare for that to happen. So ghosts are seen or perceived wearing the clothes that they think they should be wearing, and they can change their clothes based on their self-image. And we've seen that. In fact, one of my long-running cases, the Moss Beach Distillery Restaurant, after a medium from Japan had a conversation with the ghost back in 1991, that ghost had been seen wearing blue clothing circa 1930 for decades. Conversation with that ghost by that medium with some fashion advice, which was very bizarre as far as I was concerned. We heard from people working the restaurant who saw the ghost again, saw the same face that they'd seen before, but she was now wearing a little black dress, and she's worn different clothing otherwise. We see folks at other places also in different clothing as well, and again, different ages than they were when they died. So it's about the self-image, and part of that is how the ghost is putting that signal out. And that goes to my next question. Do ghosts have ESP? And the answer is yes, they have to. That is actually maybe it's not the ESP we think of that living humans have, but they have to. And the reason they have to is the P for perception. Perception is not the same as sense. Perception is the process that happens in our consciousness in our brains that allows us to view or to understand the world around us. And for a person without a body to see you, their perceptual process has to have some other way of getting that information, which would be by definition non-sensory or extrasensory, ESP. In order for them to connect with people, that would have to be some form of telepathy or something, but it's a form of ESP. So when someone perceives a ghost, it's a two-way street. It's their ESP seeing you, hearing you, feeling you, and your ESP on the other side getting that information and going back and forth. It's that two-way communication that's going on there. So the other side of that is, do ghosts have psychokinesis or mind over matter ability? And yes, there's evidence that some do. Most apparitions don't come with physical activity along with them. Some of the longer term experiences, it seems like the ghost learns to do PK. And I want to recommend, if you've not seen the movie Ghost with Patrick Swayze from 1990, absolutely watch that movie. You'll have a better idea of what I'm talking about here. We know, again, that because ghosts are not optical, the only way that they could appear on a piece of film or in a digital camera legitimately is if they affect the camera or the recording medium, whether it's film, magnetic media, flash drive, or whatever. In other words, they have to affect that. By the way, that is by definition what happens with electronic voice phenomena. Electronic voice phenomena is happening because the ghost is affecting the device or the recording medium. Otherwise, it is not electronic voice phenomena. In other words, if it's acoustical sound that's being recorded, that's not EVP. That's voice phenomena. It's a completely different thing. And even then, we have something else happening with it. So it's all, do ghosts have PK? Well, some apparently do in that sense. All right, let me go back to here. If cameras and photography can't detect the anomaly, what tools are best to use the field to pick up the anomalous shifts? You're looking for correlation, not causation, in science. And because we have no idea what a ghost is made out of, we have been using basically environmental sensors. That's where EMF comes in, or geomagnetic sensors, or temperature sensors, anything that can tell you what's going on in the environment at the time someone's having an experience. Again, we define ghosts. Somebody saying there was a ghost here, it's because a human had an experience. That's the only thing that tells us there's a ghost there. So you need to connect the human experiences and the pattern of those experiences to any anomalies or changes in the environment. That's the only thing we can do. for that. There are no devices, doesn't matter what the claims are out there, that absolutely can detect a ghost, again, because we don't know what's going on. Now, there's some evidence that apparitions can, like living humans, can affect the electromagnetic environment. So that's one reason to use EMF in any way. But most EMF sensors are set to pick up the electromagnetic fields given off by our technology and electrical systems. So that would mean that the apparition is either intentionally affecting those devices, or whatever they're made of affects that part of the electromagnetic spectrum and the environment. Whereas if you're using a natural EMF meter, which picks up the sum of them of the fields that are not created by technology, living humans affect those too. So you have to kind of play around with multiple environmental sensors, but most importantly, having some human indicates something's also happening as well. At the very least, it's got to be in a place where living humans have recently and hopefully frequently had experiences with things. Also, I should mention that there have been correlations, and not completely consistent, but fairly consistent, with residual hauntings, where EMF and other devices have picked up fields that are unexplained otherwise. Turn all the power off, you still get in the field. That's really weird, where that imprint seems to be. So that's a correlation, again, not necessarily causation for that. Okay. Let's see here. Have you heard of the Life After Death project concerning Forrest J. Ackerman? Yeah. Actually, I've watched the video. I've got the book on that. Can't remember the guy's name off the top. Paul. What's Paul's? I can't remember his name. There was a director who was involved with that. I think it's really fascinating. I also find it really fascinating that the skeptics say, well, he wouldn't possibly, there's no such thing as life after death. So the idea that anybody's in contact with Forrest Ackerman it makes no sense whatsoever. Well, that's kind of ridiculous. That means that if there is life after death, why not? For those who don't know who Forrest Ackerman was, Forrest Ackerman was the kind of publisher of Famous Monsters of Filmland. He was incredibly well known and popular person in science fiction, fantasy, and horror fandom. He had an incredible collection at his home in LA. It was called the Acker Mansion of old science fiction, horror, fantasy, film, and TV memorabilia. Just an amazing, I've read so many interviews by him, editorials by him. I used to buy Famous Monsters of Filmland and some of his other publications growing up as well. So really interesting guy. And worth looking at the project. I'm trying to remember what it's actually called. If I had time to get up, I could actually look at that and see if I can actually spot the book really easily. I think I can probably get it before we finish tonight. Okay. What else we got? And I noticed the Graveyard Grog posted something about the orb phenomena as well. And, the orb craze, which is still a craze, and it's unfortunately, I still get people sending me videos and photos, and it's really annoying, frankly, because there's no real evidence that the orb phenomena relates to spirits at all. So, and one of the folks who's with us right now, Dave Manganelli, professional videographer and photographer, years ago I had gave him a task to try to accidentally on purpose create all sorts of orbs and things, and he sent me a whole bunch of pictures of normal explanation, but kind of sometimes unusual things for reflections and such. Okay, let's see here. What else we have? Is there evidence that a residual haunting can occur in a place the ghost has never been, but perhaps wanted to be? Well, it depends. If the residual haunting refers to a person who lived at one point, then technically that person would have to have been there to have been recorded. We don't know if actual apparitions can leave a residual, can leave an imprint. But what we do, one of the issues that has come up, a man named John Sabol, S-A-B-O-L, you might want to go to academia.edu and put his name in there. He has written a paper and has made some suggestions, which I think have a lot of validity, that ghost hunters going to these public places may be leaving their own ghost story behind. In other words, creating a residual impression of their story. And that's a problem. That means that going forward in time, the original residue or imprint that might have been there, we don't even know for sure it was, that led to the story that this being promoted, that might be supplanted or recorded over by this new story, these ghost hunters. I can give you an example that may not even be a real residual, although at this point I believe there's so much activity around this story, it makes sense. Back in the 1960s, Tony Cornell, who is a luminary in the field and was connected to the Society for Psychical Research, 50 plus year veteran of doing investigations. If you can find a used copy of his book, Investigating the Paranormal, do so. It's fortunately out of print. Tony told a story about investigating a pub in England and determining after talking to witnesses and people in the area that the story, and looking at the historical record, the story didn't hold water. And actually, he and his people actually commented that it wasn't a great ghost story to begin with. So as they finished the investigation and did the kind of discussion with the people there, they over several ales and beers and whatever else, they came up with another ghost story. Just, wouldn't it be a better story if? And everybody who was present knew that it wasn't a real story, except that that's the story. The new story is the story that is the folklore around this place today. So things can change in that sense. Elise, I'm glad to hear that that's your favorite book. All right, Tina, New York Nerds. Why do some people class life after death contact as all bad, even some non-fundable? Well, because of religious and other folklore. There's folklore in different countries, in different cultures, that made people afraid of the dead, interpreting different things about ghosts and other phenomena, and that sticks even if it's not religious. And sometimes religious belief has a root in the culture that the religion got started in, so the Middle East. And what was believed about it. And of course, there's all sorts of folklore. I mean, I'd say that there's a lot of beliefs around ghosts, around psychic phenomena and other things, and about psychics and people having psychic abilities, that it differs from culture to culture. I just finished teaching, or I'm just finishing in 2 weeks. I'll finish the last week of my paranthropology class, which looks at paranormal beliefs around the world and how to assess them, and what anthropologists have really written about them. So the bad thing also is, honestly, the bigger influence today is pop culture. People believe what they see in the movies. If there's any claim that it's inspired by or based on a true story, movie makers always or almost always make those kinds of stories horror movies. Even though, and it's really weird because if you look at the majority of actual ghost movies, they are dramas and comedies going all the way back. So it just really depends. But people are affected by high emotion, and fear is a high emotion in that sense. Yeah, Graveyard Greg. I was very fortunate. I did speak to Tony Cornell before I got to meet him on the phone back in the late 90s, but I was so happy to spend a day with him in the early 2000s. And in fact, if you go to the Parapsychology Foundation's YouTube channel, just go to youtube.com and put in Parapsychology Foundation, you will see that there is a 2-part Reality of Ghost Hunting conference with myself, Tony Cornell, Hans Holzer, and Carlos Alvarado. And it's a really interesting thing. I'll say that Holzer's stuff got Tony Cornell. He was sitting next to me and he was squeezing my arm to keep from laughing. Sadly, I think Holzer was, I don't know if he was just trying to get a rise out of people or not in that case. Okay. Suzanne, I misspoke saying residual visitations by Moss. I assume you mean Moss Beach lady who has visited you in different places. So apparitions, who are conscious in our model, can go almost anywhere, as long as they know that they can go anywhere. I mean, they're not trapped in a location. That's really clear. So many apparitional experiences are people who visited their family members or loved ones shortly after they died, and that could be all over the country, so far away, very far, or over the world, far away from where they died, or even where they lived. So it's not the case that they are stuck any more than human beings. In fact, they're probably better able to travel than the rest of us because they don't need a plane ticket, or they can hop on a cruise ship if they wanted to. Can't really enjoy the food, but or the amenities, but they can still move around. Okay. Her attachment might have been to you, not to the rest. No, she was seen in other places as well. Had nothing to do with the restaurant. Attachment for apparitions is psychological. It's not a rule in any way, shape, or form. All right, in physical mediumship, is ectoplasm a true form of evidence of spirit? Yeah, well, first, is the ectoplasm something that has truly been created by the body of that medium, or is ectoplasm fraud? Because there's so much fraud in that world, in the physical mediumship world. Ectoplasm means spirit matter. It's really clear that spirits don't need to manifest themselves in other apparitional experiences. Physical mediumship may be about the psychokinesis of the medium and not even about spirit contact at all. It's not the best evidence for life after death in any way, shape, or form. Most of the time, we just got through this question with my students in my survival class. Most of the time, the medium may only speak to one spirit, his or her control spirit, who often can provide no evidence whatsoever that they are the people that they say they were. In the 4-hour plus session that I did with Kai Mugi, who is a part of the Felix circle in Germany, honestly, it was not the best experience, and there was some fraud for sure. I will say that his control spirit was Hans Bender, who was a deceased parapsychologist, and yet none of what Hans Bender said the character said through Kai was any evidence whatsoever it was Hans Bender. So there was nothing said that would connect to Hans Bender's life. No information about his life. Even then, it could have been just easy to look up, but nothing like that. So that's a problem. If the medium the physical medium can communicate with a deceased person who is related to one of the people sitting there, then we need to assess that evidence the same way we assess it with mental mediums. Otherwise, there's really no absolute indication that any of it has to do with spirit at all. Again, because we know that living people can cause PK as well, do PK as well. All right, anthropologists tend to give short shrift to the spirit world, but pop culture tends to turn spirit in terror or comedy. That is absolutely true. Some anthropologists have actually provided some really good reference, but remember, they're not looking for psychic phenomena. They're not looking to interpret things in that way. They're approaching the culture in a very different way. If you can find a copy of a long out-of-print book, either called Living Magic or Primitive Psychic Power by a man named Ronald Rose, he was on a grant to study ESP with the Australian Aboriginals back in the 1950s, and the grant was actually from the Duke Parapsychology Lab, or through them. He worked with J.B. Rhine, so that's a good account. Also, there's a book by A.P. Elkins called Aboriginal Men of High Degree, which references Aboriginal telepathy as well. And other Elkins books, I think, also do kind of talk about that. So it really depends on the anthropologist. I had long talks with my anthropology professors at Northwestern, and one of whom was actually subscribing to the Journal of Parapsychology. So he was somebody knowledgeable about the field. So it just really depends on what they're doing. They give short shrift to it, as you say, to the spirit world in terms of talking about real phenomena, but they do talk about the beliefs. So it's a little different approach in that sense. But you're right. Pop culture, it's about ratings. It's about sales at movies, the box office. It's about portraying things in ways that are going to get emotional reactions from people. Even the movie Ghost has the whole idea of shadowy figures pulling down the bad guys, spirits to the underworld. That doesn't come from any reports we actually have. But, it was a way to add drama to the thing. And otherwise, the movie pulls at your heartstrings, which is emotional as well. So does the movie Hereafter, which does a decent job of presenting near-death experiences, sort of mediumship, and then apparitions are kind of pretty well done as well. All right. Oh, Living Magic is on the internet. Oh, that's great. If Living Magic is in the Internet Archive, Ronald Rose's book, take a look, folks, and download that book. I hadn't even checked to see if it was. It's a really fascinating book, actually. And there's actually some kind of a kind of a mini journal of sorts you can find on the Internet Archive and other places, older issues of Paranthropology, specifically looking at this issue of psi and anthropology, and then also books by or edited by or by Jack Hunter. There are a number of books that look at cross-cultural stuff related to parapsychology as well. So there are a lot of free journals, his free journals, but go to Amazon, put in Jack Hunter, and I'm looking at I have several of his titles here, including one on mediumship around the world. So take a look at those as well. Okay, well, that was kind of rapid fire there. I guess we have a little low, which is fine, because I have a couple other questions here. Let me just see if I've got something coming in on text as well. Okay. All right. So one of the things that comes up, when I do in some conferences or occasionally when I'm talking to groups, has to do with what people should do if they think their house is haunted. And Edgar, I'll get to your question here in a second. And that is that calling a local, there's so many local ghost hunting groups around, so many out there, like thousands of ghost hunting groups out there that have websites at this point in the United States alone. Many of them follow whatever methodology of their favorite TV team and don't really know anything about how parapsychologists, psychical researchers have conducted investigations in the past. And so before you call someone, here are the questions I would ask on a phone call, because I always have a pre-interview before even considering doing an investigation. And one question is, what makes you think these events are paranormal? That's an important question. Why do you think they're paranormal? Because a lot of normal things can be interpreted as paranormal if you're not looking for the explanations. And in fact, there were a couple surveys by real estate companies and some articles written after the pandemic, after the lockdown, that there was a huge rise in people claiming that their homes were haunted. And the realtors determined, rightly so, that was because people were noticing things going on in their homes that they had never noticed before because they hadn't been stuck in their homes for 24 hours a day. That included the sounds that a house makes, things that actually naturally, again, because of shifting of homes, of buildings that can happen due to temperature changes. There can actually be physical things that you witness, things falling, things like that. And people were looking for, making statements about stuff they did clumsily that they should have been responsible for. So we always look for any report of a house being haunted or some activity. We look at the various events or bits of activity that are reported. We look overall, is there an indication of something psychic or paranormal happening? But we look at the individual events to sweep away the things that have normal explanations so that we are left with the things that might truly have a paranormal explanation or cause behind them. It is natural for people who are afraid, have a fear reaction, to mislabel normal things in addition to the paranormal stuff. So, for example, somebody sees an actual ghost. Maybe it's only one time. I have a lot of those happening. But even if it was only one time, they're naturally sensitive, like observationally sensitive to anything out that they notice that might be out of the ordinary, that they then put under that heading of the ghost did it. This is not uncommon. It is normal human reaction, especially with fear. Not what's really interesting is people have multiple ghostly experiences and are curious. They always look for the normal explanations before including that. It's the fear reaction. It's the anxiousness. And again, it's very normal for people to mislabel things in those circumstances. Um, so that's an important piece of this, which is one of the reasons why we need to actually ask a lot of questions up front as well. The problem is that too many ghost hunter groups or ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, make an assumption that if people think it's ghostly, it must be ghostly. They don't actually ask questions up front. May not even ask questions on site. They'll just pull out their equipment and wander around and see if they can get any unusual readings and things and EVPs. Frankly, that's not an investigation. And if you're trying to help the people at all, is you really, really need to understand what's going on. Dave is pointing out, because Dave Manganelli has been doing investigations for many decades as well. Groups will call multiple groups to investigate their home, and they only listen to the one that tells them what they want to hear. That is absolutely true. And the fact is, I always tell folks that they need to vet the group, ask them what they're going to do, what they know about the subject. And frankly, doing bad investigations, bad methodology for 30 years doesn't make someone knowledgeable if they're constantly relying on folklore, religion, bad understanding of physics, pop culture, reality TV, bad science in general, and their own assumptions. That makes people very bad investigators. They're still investigators, but they're very bad ones. So asking questions, and I'm going to get to another piece here in a moment. All right, so Edgar C., what's your take on demonic possession? I don't have a take on demonic possession. I don't believe in demons. We really don't have good examples of really, number one, demons, the way people view them, are a very Judeo-Christian and actually mainly Catholic Christian interpretation of something. Mythology. And it's mythology. It's religious mythology, but there's not, it's whatever people believe. And the idea of a demonic entity, something malevolent or evil, the power of evil, that comes from a very folkloric religious place. It does not come from a place that has establishment in science. That's number one. Number two, demons, by definition, are created by God. If they're fallen angels, and angels are created by God, and demons are created by God. In fact, the devil is a creation of religion, and again, would be created by God. So if you believe in God or gods, those things are created by God. We cannot, in science, study something that is magically created, because God is magic, just by this entity that lives in the sky or wherever. We can't study that. Plus, there is, I've talked to people even in the church who have said that, number one, if it's the Catholic Church, they do a significant amount of work with the individual who's supposedly possessed well before they do an exorcism. And it's very rare for them to actually do an exorcism. Although there is a group in the Catholic Church that is a little bit more towards doing more of that. It is not something that should be done. Exorcism, deliverance ceremony should not be done without exploring every other possibility. First, there have been people killed, not in Catholic exorcisms as far as I know, but in deliverance ceremonies and other religious rites. There was a couple and a pastor who have been in court. They've been criminally charged because a child died. I know of a situation, in fact, in that situation, it was a 2-year-old, and the parents thought the kid was possessed because the kid was always acting up. Frankly, for those of you who have 2-year-olds or have been around 2-year-olds, that's not an unusual thing. So I don't buy the demon thing any more than it's not an approach that's scientific. I also grew up Jewish. We don't have demons. We don't have any of that. In fact, if you really go by the at any point. So enough of that for that. TAPS, okay, the group. So TAPS family groups, people call and ask them questions and ask what's, so yeah, 9 out of 10 times in the end, they would ask if Jay and Grant could come to their house, right? Fact is that I know some folks who actually had knowledge about parapsychology that definitely became TAPS family group members. Their group became a group member because that actually got them cases. One of them, run by my late friend Pete Haviland, he said 50% of the time they went out on what sounded like legitimate cases. The people would be upset with them when they showed up without TV cameras and without Jay and Grant or anybody from the TV show. At which point Pete would pack up. They would just leave because that clearly indicates a motivation of possibly wanting to be on TV for that. So that's a problem. Susanna said, I've always enjoyed the fact there are no Jewish vampires. It's always a cross, never a Star of David. They're waving around. Yeah, except in The Fearless Vampire Killers, an old Roman Polanski movie in the 1960s, which I believe the joke here came from Woody Allen originally, where at one point there's an old vampire and one of the individuals pulls out a cross and holds it up, and the vampire says, listen, buddy, have you got the wrong vampire? So, different thing. In the comic books, I know for a fact, because I can think of several comic books in the past, where it's any religious icon would fight off Dracula. Wouldn't matter. It's the power of faith, not the actual icon itself, that would do it. So like doing this to a vampire wouldn't do anything. You'd have to have something in your religion. And if you're an atheist, you're really kind of screwed in that case. Okay. Let's see. Always interested in paranormal phenomena. That's from Mary Pranks. I read an interview of 29 years ago. Real Ghostbusters. Yeah. Curious about that. You recovered the magazine. I wonder what magazine that was. Quilt Song, hello. And Graveyard Grog, back to the TAPS thing. You got ghosted for that. I've gotten calls from people who have asked me at the end of the pre-interview, do you think this is good for a movie? For a TV movie, or you think they'll be at that point, I will say to them, you just made this very difficult for me to come out or even recommend somebody investigate. And I explain why, and I say, thank you for calling. If this persists and you're interested in keeping this confidential, we can talk. One of the things, by the way, about ghost hunting groups is how often I've gotten calls from people after they've had the local ghost hunters come in who were truly afraid, and now they're more afraid because the ghost hunting group basically told them they had a demon in their house and left without giving them any help. One of the questions anyone should ask a ghost hunting group or ghost hunter is, what are you going to do to help me? Not, can you prove that my house is haunted, or will you come in and see if I've got a ghost? That's fine. But what are you going to do to help me? And really, the only thing we can absolutely do is educate people about the phenomena. There are no guarantees. There are limitations to what we can do. Some psychics have been very successful, certainly in dealing with residual hauntings. That's actually not as much of a problem. There are other techniques we've used to kind of delete or record over that residual haunting. When it comes to actual apparitions, there's difficulty. And the difficulty is you're dealing with a conscious person. So communication is key. And then there are some things like annoying the ghost out. There have been techniques that have worked, but ultimately we can't guarantee that. With poltergeist phenomena, where it's purely physical, we're dealing with living people who are causing that. And if the person we identify as the poltergeist agent is unwilling to accept responsibility for it, try some techniques that we have offered, which include, by the way, blowing off steam, dealing with counseling and things like that. If they're unwilling to even consider, and I've had cases like that. In fact, I got one right now. The person's not doing what we suggest. He can't fathom that he could possibly be responsible for it. All signs point to him. There's not a lot we can do. it's going to eventually burn out and stop, uh, because that poltergeist cases can last for a few years, but rarely do they go for a year, more than a year and a half. But unless he's addressing the key element, the thing that's causing the activity in him, there's not a lot we can do. So one of the things in my earliest stuff um, was for when we started the Office of Paranormal Investigations in 1989, after the graduate parapsychology program at JFK University finished. Um, all the literature we put out, every statement we put out, is that no one can guarantee removal or stopping the phenomena. It's just not possible to guarantee that. So that's one thing that we have to always put out there as well. Paul, I will probably be teaching the survival class again next spring. So it's not again until next year. We have other classes we have to offer first. Right. Oh, the Disney Adventures magazine. Okay, so I have the English version of that. I have several copies of that, by the way, Mary Prankster. I do know that they published that in Spanish as well. Didn't know, interesting you found that. Very cool that you actually found that as well. So yeah, I did a couple of interviews for Disney Adventures back in the 80s and 90s as well. So that was a digest-sized magazine. They did some UFO stuff. They had a bunch of fun stuff. So that was one. That was around the time that I also did an interview. I think it was at the same time I did interviews for Southwest Airlines magazine. They did a profile on me for Southwest on their flight magazine too. So I have copies of all these things typically here. Let's see. Let's see what's popping up here. Shadim are wicked spirits in the Tanakh, but do not correspond exactly to demons in Christianity. Yeah. Mazakin, found in the Talmud, are invisible demons, create minor annoyances or disease. Yeah, they're, in the Jewish religion and in folklore from that period, disease was often called by, all over the world, until we had understanding there actually were germs. Most people thought evil spirits, in almost every culture, evil spirits or the gods were creating illness, disease, misfortune, and things like that. Different names for different things. Some they really didn't correspond to biblical demons, more like kind of nature spirits and other kinds of things that are there. And of course, there's other kinds of folklore, Celtic folklore of the Sidhe, the Fae, the Banshee, the all sorts of kind of ancient spirits and other things that are not human per se, elementals in some cultures, things like that. So there's different cultural background here all over the place. And it's really important to understand the culture and where things come from, and not to assume that because something was talked about for centuries as something that suddenly, that it's still that's the explanation for it. We have a better understanding of what we think apparitions are, humans, for the most part. Werewolves come from Jewish belief, the descendants of Benjamin. Actually, werewolves come from a lot of other places as well. Did you know that there's folklore of were-bears in China? And there are were-foxes, and the whole idea of werewolves, while it comes from a particular tradition, there's a lot of similar humans into animals, whether they're cursed or intentionally transform into animals. Even a skinwalker in Navajo tradition is a magic worker who puts on an animal skin and becomes the animal. That's a skinwalker. You want to read the history of werewolves? It is on the Internet Archive. It's also been printed up many times. There was a famous famous religious figure in the 19th century named Montague Summers. And Montague Summers published books a book on werewolves, a couple books on vampires, and a couple of books on witchcraft, including a history of witchcraft. Fascinating books. I have them. I own them because they were published in the 70s by University Press. Definitely worth tracking down. And again, the Internet Archive, just put Montague Summers in there and you'll pick up his stuff. How would you reconcile cynical friends with those who follow parapsychology approach, with those who are absolute believers in TV shows? Wow. if they believe that what they see on TV is real and everything's real, ask them if they think that everything they see on like Real Housewives is real. Ask them if they think that every reality TV show is real. Because I grew up in the television industry. My father was a producer. My uncle was a director. If I got family still, my brother David just actually hit 20 years in the Today Show and 40 years working for NBC. Fact is, television doesn't portray things as they actually happen. Paranormal reality shows, they shoot hours and hours and hours. I'll give you an example. I shot a piece for a TV show for Hour Magazine, which was a daytime TV show in the 1980s and into the 90s. And this was something for Halloween. We spent 10 hours shooting a 4-minute piece. We shot at the Winchester Mystery House. We shot at JFK University. We did a mock-up, which was clearly labeled a mock-up of an actual case recreation, and it all became 4 minutes on the show. That's when after Ghostbusters came out. That's television. I remember Jason from Ghost Hunters at one of his conferences saying that they would shoot 20 hours, 30 hours to get a 22-minute segment on TV. And unless the people who have credibility and ethics are in the edit room and can affect the actual final product, which, by the way, is not the case at all. What appears on TV is from the producers, not even from the investigators, who are often doing things that the TV show tells them to do. And you can tell your friends, here's a really good example. When somebody shoots something, let's say you're watching a TV show where they are investigating an underground city, because there have been series about the hidden underground cities in various places around the world. Or it's somebody who's going into a cave for the first time. So the host will say, I'm about to be the first person since the ancient Romans to walk into this space. And they cut to the guy coming into the space. How's that work? Did the Romans leave a cameraman and a camera set up? Well, what's going on is he probably was the first person in there, and they shot it from behind. Then they stuck someone inside to shoot him coming in. That's reality TV, but that's not what really happened. The Real Housewives, well, let me back up. I have done so much TV over the years, and the directors will always tell me at one point, they'll ask me a question, even the sit-down interviews, they'll ask me a question and say, all right, can you give me that again, but shorter? Can you give me a longer explanation? Can you say it this way? And as long as it's within what I feel like I can say, I will repeat it so that they have the piece that will fit the show. You're not seeing reality on reality TV. It's as simple as that. Real Housewives, when they get into a fight, it's usually a really big fight on the show. They might have actually had an argument on camera, at which point the director said, let's do that again, but this time really amp it up, because that's what the audience wants. And then, yes, there are, and I know this from having to talk to soap opera actors. My uncle was a soap opera director. There are those times that people really do believe, who watch soap operas, really believe that the person on the soap is the same as their character. All right, let me go back a little bit here. I wonder why people create folklore or mythology per se. The reality is that telling stories is human. Telling ghost stories to spook people around the campfire, that goes back, there are traditions of storytelling going back thousands of years. Folklore, though, often becomes talked about so much it becomes part of the world. There are people will unintentionally create folklore. Phony physical mediums, the fakes, created the folklore that they have to do everything in the dark. And physical mediumship didn't start out in the dark, but eventually, as more and more phonies learned that they could do more and more, the darker and darker the room was, to the point where they could do a lot in pure darkness to convince people something was going on, that became the expectation for seances from clients who go to a potentially real physical medium and say, what do you mean you're working in the light? That makes no sense. All these other mediums get really great stuff in the dark. How can you possibly do that? That's like a person going to see a psychic and the psychic sitting down with them and the person says, where are your tarot cards? And believe me, that does happen. I know from the psychics and mediums I've worked with. So, the fact is that people expect certain things, and if you've got clients, you're going to have to keep going with that. And that becomes folklore. I mean, the idea that ghosts appear in the dark, that they have to do investigations in the dark, is completely from the folklore around physical mediumship. But more importantly, it's because producers have always wanted to make these segments and shows spooky. In the 1980s, when I did a lot of TV because of Ghostbusters, we would go to places where the phenomena was happening during the daytime, but they wanted to shoot at night because it's more atmospheric or spookier. And there were times that the director would say, can we turn the lights out? And the cameraman rightly would say, yeah, but then we can't show anything unless, remember, TV is a visual medium. So they wanted to go into the dark. And we did a lot of things with darker, spookier settings, even though it was not necessary. And once Night Shot happened, that was the boon producers had actually wanted. So it's just, they put it out there and people believe that what they see on TV is real. That's all we can do. Okay, let's see here. Let's go down a little further. Just trying to find this. Nanette's Blood Rose Horror Nightmare. Hi, Nanette, or whoever you are. Could tell me where I can find more information on the subject of apparitions. Well, that's a good start. You can find more information on the subject of apparitions in my book, A Paranormal Casebook. I just published the second edition a couple months ago. Any of my books actually on ghostly things. So if you look me up on Amazon, you'll see several of my books having to do ghostly stuff. There's quite a bit of information on that. You can also look up, there should be stuff on the Internet Archives. I believe there's a book called Apparitions, and it's Hauntings and Apparitions, and I believe it's Alan Mackenzie, that is now in the public domain. Also, the Society for Psychical Research, it's spr.ac.uk, has something called the Psi Encyclopedia. That's PSI, Psi Encyclopedia. So it's spr.ac.uk. And the Psi Encyclopedia has extensive articles written by people in the field on apparitions, reincarnation, you name it, it's in there. It's, don't go to Wikipedia, go to the Psi Encyclopedia. And you can also just simply Google Psi Encyclopedia. Again, it's PSI, Psi Encyclopedia, and then put in the letters SPR after that. You'll get right to it as well. So that's a really good place to start. Also, if you send me an email, I can send you my email is simply askprofparanormal@gmail.com, or simply profparanormal, as in Professor Paranormal, profparanormal@gmail.com, and ask me for information on apparitions. Happy to send you stuff and where else you can find things. So that's a good place to start. Okay, we're bears and we're foxes. Let's see. All right. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm not even sure if I pronounce that. Alexite TV. Always happy to talk about the family stuff and all the stuff that I did around TV myself over the years. My YouTube channel, my other YouTube channel, which is simply youtube.com/Lloyd Auerbach, has a lot of my TV appearances, including that Hour Magazine piece that I mentioned as well. Let's see. Elise, you totally misquoted on a TV show about Conjuring House. Came out looking like a believer instead of a historian. Yeah, that's the other problem with television. We do interviews, and they often ask you to repeat the question as at the beginning, and they will often cut that off and just use pieces of what you say out of context. That happens quite a bit. It's happened to me more than a few times. That's one of the reasons I like live podcasts and live interviews, even if they're pre-recorded, because they're not edited so much. I just did an interview for Russian television, by the way. It was a local videographer who did it, but we did an interview talking about the U.S. Stargate program, the remote viewing program, because I co-authored a book called ESP Wars, East and West, and God knows what they're going to do with that, or the translation. I have no idea what's going to happen with that. Okay, we only have a couple of minutes. I'll see if I can get to these last questions. Can panpsychism be postulated as a potential explanation of certain anomalous phenomena, like those distant healing? So panpsychism says that everything has consciousness or spirit, including rocks and things. The universe itself is conscious and sentient. You know, it's a philosophy. It's a philosophical approach to how the universe works and consciousness itself. And sure, it provides explanations, but we don't know if that's actually a true. You know, if that is true, if dualism's true, it's very possible there's kind of a combination of all these different things. Graveyard Grog, if they wanted to see a real investigation, it's not the intriguing jump scare roller coaster dramatic ride. Yeah, you know, I have a very low startle, well, I should say a high startle reflex. So basically, I don't get startled very easily. I've been in cases where some noise has happened and people have jumped and I haven't jumped at all. And it turns out there's a normal explanation for it as well. I've had paranormal experiences or psychic experiences in places from time to time, but to me, they're not startling. Maybe I'm a little jaded right now, but my reaction is that was cool. You know, I've been patted on the back. I've had my arm squeezed at the USS Hornet, or at least that's what it felt like. It wasn't a physical touch. It was more of a psychic kind of perception of what was going on, what was being intended. And it's cool. You know, those are cool things. I knew a woman who believed that soap operas were being filmed in real time or real people. Sadly, that I know that too. I got to speak with Susan Lucci and other folks in All My Children when my uncle was directing it years and years and years ago. And I was an extra on the show that day. And I did talk to some of the folks and they said, yeah, they get approached on the street and, you know, actors have this experience as well. I mean, think about William Shatner. And I don't know if you have never seen the Saturday Night Live skit, Get a Life, where Shatner says, get a life. You absolutely need to go to SNL's YouTube channel or just simply Google William Shatner, Get a Life. You'll come up with his book and also a YouTube video from SNL. And it's the actual segment is based on something that really happened at a Star Trek convention. And I got to say that ghost hunting conventions these days, ghost conventions look more and more like fan conventions for TV people because they believe anything anybody who's speaking says. And I'm going to give you a quick example before we finish tonight. Oh, thank you. Lexite. Okay, boron. Thank you for that. Essentially, I overheard somebody at the Oregon Ghost Conference who was doing a talk that ghosts are subatomic in nature, which is possible. I mean, maybe they are a quantum particle field that is conscious and able to connect. But he explained orbs as saying that a quantum particle reflected the light from the flash, and that created the orb, the quantum particle that was part of the ghost. And if anybody wants to look this up, quantum particles are like really, really, really tiny. In fact, they're smaller than photons. There is literally no way in physics for a single quantum particle, which is what he said, to actually reflect light. Just not physically possible. So, and he made a number of other bad statements about physics. Not to say that people on the other side, the disbelievers, the skeptics, also do the same thing. Make claims about physics that are actually showing a lack of understanding of physics because they're not physicists. And then lastly, Rose is saying, Blood Rose, Night Horror Nightmare. I do think a certain part of an actor's performance, what is part of who they are, but never thought that they were the character. Yeah, that people will put something into it, but there are also method actors like Christian Bale and Daniel Day-Lewis who are not really the people they pretend to be, or Joaquin Phoenix, even though they kind of take on that persona. for that time. So anyway, we are done for tonight. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and that's on July 7th. And just to let you know in advance, and we'll have to post something on next time on the channel as well, I'll be skipping 3 weeks instead of 2 weeks. So it'll be July 7th and then July 28th. That will be the one after that. So just due to a conflict I have with some travel that I've got. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thanks for the questions. Again, my email is askprofparanormal@gmail.com or just profparanormal@gmail.com. Have a great couple of weeks. Have a great July 4th, and we'll see you in the future.